we decided that we would talk about future-proofing equitation using an evidence-based learning and practice approach. And so this is really what our talk is about, is trying to explain what we mean by EBL and EBP. In other words, we want to obviously completely swamp you with new terminology because we know equitation science is all about that, really. So hopefully by the end of it, you will actually understand what we're talking about. So equitation, I think Andrew's already described to you the important sort of difference between equitation and equitation science. Equitation is obviously all about the practice of training and riding, handling and so on horses, whereas equitation science is much more about the sort of embedding of the scientific rigor, the scientific approach into equitation so that we can enhance equitation. I don't need to tell you that horse riding is extremely popular. And here's some facts and figures, and I'm sure that these are massive underestimates, and you probably have much more up-to-date figures. But just really to show that there are lots of horses, there are lots of horse people, and there are lots of clubs and societies, and there are increasing numbers of children who are getting more and more interested in being able to ride and owning a horse. There's always this sort of trend of an increase in interest after some great occasion. And in the UK recently, we've just had our first UK winner of Wimbledon, who's Scottish, by the way, not English, and has made that very clear. And now we can see, especially with the warmer weather, we can see children all over the place picking up tennis rackets and charging out and bashing balls around and breaking lots of windows, especially my children. And we can see this with horse riding as well. Increasingly, we see more children getting keen. They all want to win Olympics or go around badminton or train a racehorse to win the Kentucky Derby. And they really believe that they can do that now because they can see that there's huge successes, just things that they've seen on the television. And they have heroes that they worship and they want to emulate. We're also seeing post these sorts of events, so post the Olympics in the UK, for example, and it's probably a similar pattern in other countries, especially those who lost out to the UK in dressage, eventing, show jumping. We're seeing that our UK government has suddenly latched onto the fact that we might actually be able to have a positive reputation when it comes to horse riding, and therefore they're prepared to pump more money into funding the sport, but not just funding the elite riders, but also funding some grassroots different possibilities such as hoof and trot to be trim, apparently, is the next thing. Just basically getting people out there and enjoying being out in the countryside and riding horses, so increasing participation. Now, all of this is fantastic, especially if you're a horse lover, but as Andrew and others today will be talking about, there is a darker side to horse riding. This is, I think, an event that happened relatively recently in perhaps in this state, but in a state nearby to here, if not this one. And this is unfortunately quite common, people falling off their horses and then the accident being more than just get back on your horse, but actually someone having to be airlifted off to hospital, having been bucked off their horse. And in the UK, we see more and more riders having to be airlifted because the sorts of accidents that they're having are so dangerous, that they're being airlifted to hospitals. And they, in fact, account for many more of the uses of air ambulances than any other sport. The worrying thing is that these injuries aren't necessarily happening at big events and where people are being asked to jump or horses are being asked to jump big jumps. They're injuries that occur predominantly when people are out just having a nice happy hack, a nice ride out around the countryside, or when they're attempting to school their horses in a field or in an arena. And I think it's important to also recognise that although falls do account for the majority of these accidents, up to 10% of these are also occurring when horses are being handled from the ground. suspect if I did a sort of little hand count now of people who've been trodden on by their horse or bowled over by their horse, there's probably about 90% of us in this room. There's probably a little bit less, I hope, of people who've ended up in hospital. But certainly I suspect that most of us have been on the receiving end of some sort of injury as a result of being in contact with a horse that we're very familiar with. And we now know, and this is really quite worrying for those of us who are parents who've got children who, we would like to see riding horses, but we know that horse riding is more dangerous than most other sports. And it kind of shocked me a little bit when my son, I have to say, pointed this fact out to me as he tried to prepare me for the fact that he wanted to have a motorbike, was that horse riding is 20 times as dangerous as motorcycling. Now, what Hayley, who's put these pictures together, has pointed out to me is if you actually look at the sorts of accidents that are happening, they're quite similar. Slide accidents, squashing accidents, and bouncing on your head accidents. And whilst it's quite, it might be quite amusing to look at this, these are obviously extremely worrying. And the difference in some respects is the sort of equipment, the safety equipment that the motorcyclists do wear, and the fact that they are sitting on a stationary, or they're sitting on an inanimate object that doesn't have a mind of its own and isn't trying to save itself. So, you can see that there are differences between the sports in the way in which people protect themselves. But the fact is that motorcycling, which looks to me to be a very dangerous sport, is less dangerous than riding a horse. And I thought this was really interesting. Some work that was done, or some work that was put together in 1991 to describe what was the typical horse accident. So I'll read it. The typical accident is not related to traffic. It occurs in the summer months between 11:30 and 3 o'clock in the afternoon during fine weather, when a relatively inexperienced rider who may well have sustained a previous injury falls from a mare, probably chestnut, and Irish, that has been stabled in an unapproved riding establishment and then sustains a fracture. So that is the sort of typical scenario, and probably that describes pretty much most of us in this room and most of your friends. When looking at the reasons why these sorts of accidents happen, riders, owners, trainers will often report that 70% of these accidents are due to behaviour and the training of the horse. So not necessarily anything that they did, or their competence. It's always about the competence of the horse, about whether the horse is properly trained or has exhibited some sort of problem behaviour. And what do we do about this? Well, we know that there's the possibility of huge numbers of accidents. So human beings being as they are, they tend to think about ways of protecting themselves from those accidents. Makes a lot of sense. So you're seeing a proliferation of safety gear, almost admitting that it is an extremely dangerous sport. So before you even get on a horse, you have to equip yourself with hats and safety stirrups and special yellow bibs, and now we've got blow-up jackets and and in books, and we put children through horse safety, and horse riding safety and horse road safety courses. So we know it's dangerous, and we equip ourselves with a whole load of safety gear. And there's actually a fair bit of research going into this safety gear, and a lot of money is spent on this. But what about the horse? How much do we actually do to make sure that our horses are fit for purpose? This is a picture of Hayley's little boy, not the one on the right, not the one on the right, the one on the left. She's not old enough to have the one on the right, not yet anyway. And this is Harley sitting on his little pony, Mojo, and then trying to pinch Murphy, who's Hayley's pony. That's a lovely picture of Harley on Mojo, but underneath that, knowing what we know about how dangerous horses are, I suppose the question that we really should be asking ourselves is, how fit for purpose is Mojo? How safe is it for us to put our children on these horses, especially when we blame these horses and their behaviour and their training for many of the accidents that take place? This is a sort of a parallel, if you like, that was drawn to my attention by the lovely Gemma Pearson. when I was telling her all about how difficult I was finding it, persuading my son, this is Cal, a picture of him looking like an escaped convict, getting his provisional driving license about, I don't know, a few months ago. And this is his new car, a red Fiesta, which now has white stripes all over it, which seems to be the sort of typical wear of these boys. And the insurance on these cars is around about £1,200 a year just for him to be able to drive it, which is, what's that, about $2,000 a year for just insuring that car. Because there's a recognition that 17-year-old boys in red cars with white stripes are more likely to have accidents. I was talking to Gemma about this, and she said, isn't it interesting that, you know, when you go out and buy this little red car for your son, because he's a learner driver and you want him to learn safely in it, you wouldn't actually go and buy a car and give it to him and say, here you are, Cal, here's your new car. Do you know what? The steering doesn't quite work, so if you want to go left, it doesn't always work all the time. So, and right definitely doesn't work terribly well at all. So just avoid going right. And the brakes, you know, sometimes they work and sometimes they don't work. And as for the accelerator, don't put your foot down too hard on it because it'll just be away with you and you'll end up in a hedge. So, but the fact is that we put our children and our novice riders in these sorts of vehicles. We put them on horses that really are not necessarily fit for purpose. And we don't really require that we think about how we're going to get our junior riders and so on to have a driving license, if you like, a horse driving license, to sit on horses that are actually safe for them to be on. So I suppose it might be quite amusing and so on, but I think what we're here to do today is to really start to challenge that, to start to think a little bit more about how, you know, the sorts of things that we do with our horses, how we train our horses, what we know works and why it works, and whether we think the current situation is acceptable and sustainable. A recent survey, I think it was a 2008 survey in Australia, where riders and owners and trainers were asked about what their concerns were with the horse industry, highlighted a few interesting areas. These are the sorts of welfare issues that these people who were surveyed wanted to draw attention to. They were concerned about the fact that people are using drugs to modify the behavior of horses, and that if they're not using drugs, they're using all sorts of strange and bizarre methods to try to control the behavior of those horses, or to manage the behavior of those horses, such as walking their horses continuously for 10 to 12 hours before they go into a show ring to try to prevent the horse from misbehaving. I know in the eventing world a few years ago there was quite a lot of concern about horses having their water withheld for 24 hours before they went into the dressage arena so that they would be quiet to ride in the dressage arena. And I'm sure that there are other examples of that. And finally, sort of even worse, I suppose, the use of severe aggression towards horses so that riders can assert some sort of dominance so that they can manage those horses, that horse's behavior. These are huge concerns for people who are riders and trainers and responsible owners. And what do people do about this to try to manage their horse's behavior? Well, they tend to sort of go into the latest fashions or fads, ask their friends and all the other local experts. And you can see these sorts of fashions and fads coming through. I mean, this is 10 years ago on the left-hand side, where all the rage was to have a Dutch gag. That was going to sort out all your problems. And then sort of 5 years ago, we started to see these, I think they might be called torture-type mechanisms in the wrong hands, but these ropes and pulleys and so on as training aids. And now we're getting a reinvention of different pieces of different devices. I mean, in my day, we used to call this a grackle noseband, but apparently it's called a Mexican hiring now. And so we're seeing all of these sorts of mechanisms, walking them around for 12 hours, kitting them out in all sorts of equipment to try to manage behavior. Absolutely no evidence really that any of these are working, apart from somebody said so. And this sort of traditional approach to training, riding, managing behavior is actually getting in the way of us progressing. It's getting in the way of us future-proofing equitation, and it's getting in the way of us making horses safer for our children and our novice riders and ourselves to be around. Traditional methods are accepted because actually sometimes they're extremely effective. I don't know how many of you were smacked as children, but it certainly was something that I remember having once, I think, till my mum told my dad not to do it. And we see the same sorts of things happening in many parts of the horse industry. Traditional methods that are just constantly being used over and over again. But just because these things work doesn't mean that they're necessarily right. And up until fairly recently, there's been an underlying assumption that an absence of poor welfare equates to good welfare. And that is another thing that has got in the way of us being able to progress. The concentration on absence of negative welfare states, instead of actually starting to push forward and saying that we should be thinking about positive welfare states. The world's changing, and I think now is the time for us to really start to ask riders, trainers, owners to take an increased responsibility. Yes, there's an increased cost to having horses and an increase in prize money to be won, but there's also an increased amount of research and knowledge and information available, and there's an increased public scrutiny. So so I say this is really the time for us to start to move forward and address these concerns that are increasing about the welfare of the performance horse, or the horse that's being used as a leisure horse. How do we place the welfare of the horse first and consider it before any other motivation or goal? How do we future-proof equitation? How do we move from this traditional dogma approach to ensuring that the next generation of horses, the next generation of riders and owners and trainers and coaches are better educated about an evidence-based approach? And the whole sort of theme of this is trying to encourage us to consider how we embed a much more questioning approach into equitation, something that will support these sorts of core principles around the horse and rider safety and the horse and rider welfare. And of course that requires us to think of ways that we can change people's attitudes to horses and traditional approaches to horse management and horse training, so that we can move from one sort of area where actually there's quite a lot of satisfaction, there's quite a lot of people who are quite happy with the status quo, to the next situation where there is actually a change of behaviour because there's been a change of attitude. And that's really what ICES and the mission of ICES is all about. And we need to start to learn lessons from others who've been in a similar situation. So if we look at animal welfare science and the shift in the change in attitudes that have then driven a change in behaviour, a change in policy, change in legislation, you can see that those sorts of improvements tend to be based very much on scientific evidence, on a rigorous approach to measuring things and providing evidence. And in fact, this is James Serple, who's quite local to here, who also pointed out that that sort of approach is important, but that evidence alone is not going to result in improved welfare unless it resonates with prevailing attitudes and values. And that's why this evidence-based approach is so important, because it starts to challenge what we consider is the norm and provide other ways of looking at the same situation. So what we mean by evidence-based is that we're trying to encourage professionals to use the best evidence possible to help them to make decisions about the sorts of methods, the sorts of training treatments, and the actions that they employ to achieve their goals. And this whole field is taken from other professional fields, like the medical field and the veterinary field, where evidence-based learning, evidence-based practice is very much the sort of common language of the day. And the whole point of the evidence-based approach within equitation science is to allow us to eliminate unsound or excessively risky practices in favor of those that have better outcomes for humans and horses. So it's all based on exactly the sort of underlying philosophy that most of us, when we care about horses, share.